Hi everyone, Stefan here from Salford and Manchester Gaming Haven. I just wanted to give you a brief introductory video about my painting space and my hobbying space, and hopefully it will give you some hints and tips about how to prepare your own painting space and some of the things that you might find useful. Before I come to my desk, I just want to show you that my hobby room has a white light LED. So I have a white light LED and I have white light at my desk. I'm lucky enough, of course, to have a permanent paint station. So some of the things that I'm going to talk about might not be useful for you if you have to have a temporary hobby station, particularly things like lamps, but some of the things hopefully still will be. So just show you my desk. I have two fairly cheap office lamps or desk lamps, which have white light LEDs. I have two, one coming from each side, so that I have very little shadow. As you can see, very little shadow is cast as I'm painting, and the white light ensures that the light doesn't distort sort of my view of the colours that I'm painting on my miniatures at the time. What else? So I have my paint brushes here. I always store them flat horizontally. If you have the little plastic guards for the bristles, then I would suggest you use them. I've lost all of mine. You store them horizontally because storing them vertically can actually damage the bristles, whether they're stored. Obviously, if you store them this way, that's going to damage the bristles. But if they're slightly wet or even not visibly wet and you store them vertically this way, then the water is going to drip down into the bristle guard and it's going to slowly dissolve the adhesive that keeps the bristles on the brush. So store them flat and keep them nice and dry and keep them on your desk handy. The next thing is obviously my tools, which are stored out of the way. What do I have in here? I have a hobby knife. Try and keep this nice and sharp. When your blade starts to go blunt, that's time to replace it. So I have a hobby knife there. A set of clippers, obviously for cutting things off sprues. If you're working mostly with board games miniatures, you might not have to use this. But if you're working with any miniatures that you have to assemble that come on sprues, then you will do. I have two files, coarse and fine, for filing down particularly plastic and metal miniatures, but also sometimes resin miniatures. I have a pin vise, which I use for drilling and pinning. Some models that need assembly, sometimes the join isn't going to hold, particularly if it's a heavy miniature that's joined at a very small place, or if you know that that join is quite delicate, then sometimes it's worth drilling out and using a paper clip to pin, and I might do a video on how to do that. I also use it to drill out gun barrels as well on miniatures, just to put nice holes in gun barrels. I have a brush which I use to do final cleanup, particularly on plastic and resin miniatures after they've been cleaned up, mold lines have been removed and they've been filed down. Then it's good to give them a quick brush just to remove any remaining flash and any sort of plastic or resin dust that's left. This tool is from Games Workshop. It's for spreading textured paint around bases, which I find very useful. It saves you wasting or ruining brushes. And of course, a set of tweezers, a pair of tweezers, which is always useful. So that's in my tool cup over here. My water cup, which I've sacrificed a mug for. Always use cold water when you put your water out for cleaning your brushes, and if you ever have to clean your brushes in the sink, which I try to do sort of periodically just to give them a nice deep clean, then use cold water. Always use cold water. Warm water will slightly dissolve your brushes. Okay, will slightly dissolve the adhesive in your brushes, so please don't use warm water, use cold water. I wipe my brushes with kitchen roll, toilet roll and tissue paper. Sort of tends to fray and rub and you get sort of fluff that comes off it. Kitchen rolls are pretty solid surface to dry your brushes on. Talk to you a little bit about what I have here. So I have a painting guide. This is basically a color guide from Games Workshop. It's two-sided and it just helps me break colors down. Very often what I'll do up here is I'll put my mobile phone here with a color reference. So let's say I'm painting feathers. I'll search Google Images for some feathers that I'd like to paint. I put them up on here so that I have a nice reference and I can break the colors down into the individual smaller colors so they can build up when it comes to layering later on. That's something I might talk about in another video, but it's nice to have a color guide here. Then I have Lots of glue, so I have plastic glue. This is from Games Workshop for use with plastic miniatures. I have thin super glue. This is mostly used to harden blue tack if I'm using blue tack on bases, particularly for non-Games Workshop miniatures or anything that has a slaughter base that wants filling in. So this is a Games Workshop miniature that has a slaughter base. I've filled in the sides here with blue tack and then hardened the blue tack with thin, super cheap Loctite super glue. And that just sort of gives me a complete base, so you can't tell it's a slaughter base. Then the best super glue in the world for miniatures, which is the Blue Cap Gorilla super glue, absolutely fantastic. Comes out like a liquid almost, sets super quick like a liquid, but holds like a gel, sets super hard. That's really, really good stuff. Then I have a couple of other things. I have brush cleaner and brush restorer from Vallejo. Both very good. I periodically use these to clean off any sort of deeper dirt on brushes. Any brushes that are starting to get a little bit ragged, they get a good clean in here, and then they get sort of conditioned in the brush restorer. I also have back here from Micro, I have Microset and Microsol from Microscale Industries Incorporated for using with transfers, or you might call them decals. I might do a video on how to do decals at some point if you're interested, but they're very, very useful. Then over here I have my wet palette, super cheap, super useful. Particularly if you have, this is really useful if you do have a temporary space, or if you're one of those people like me who often has 10-15 minutes free and you want to paint, but you know that it's going to waste the paint if it dries out. I like to use a wet palette, which is super cheap. It's simply, this is even from a takeaway, but obviously a Tupperware dish. Underneath here we have a sponge cloth, with some water. And then over the top it's baking paper, not greaseproof paper, very important, use baking paper, not greaseproof paper. And then I will put my paint here. This will keep it wet and fluid for much, much longer, particularly once you're finished if you close it up. And that keeps your paints fluid for ages, really saves you on paint. Also helps dilute the paint. There's some used tissues. And then over here we have my paints. So I have all my paints stored. Whatever system you use, obviously try and have one that's useful for you, that's logical, so you know where all your paints are whenever you have to think about a particular paint. I only ever take the paints out that I need for a specific step. So if I'm doing browns or if I'm doing faces, I'll take out all the flesh paints that I need to do all the faces. I'll put them out here, and then once I'm finished with that, they'll go away again. And that way I can keep a nice space. I like to have plenty of space to work in. You don't want to feel cramped in your painting area, so I like to keep it nice and clear and only take out the paints that I need. Then over here I have a hairdryer. If anybody who knows me will know that this is certainly not for me because I am pretty much completely bald. This is obviously for helping me speed up the drying process on miniatures. Certain techniques require this as well if you're going to be using certain technical paints, particularly certain textured paints for bases. If you're trying to make volcanic bases, this is absolutely critical. I might do a tutorial, but there's a really good tutorial on volcanic bases over at Warhammer TV anyway, so I suggest you check that out if you're interested. And that's basically it. If there's any questions that you have, feel free to post in the comments. That's how I set up my painting station. It's really useful if I only have 10 or 15 minutes. I can grab a paint, I can work on what I'm working with. I can then, when I'm finished, I can close this up, and I know that the paint is still going to be fine the next day. That said, I do generally tend to paint for about 2 to 3 hours a day, every day, although maybe not in one go. Very often that will be spread out, and I'll take breaks in between, and it's very important to take breaks. I try never to sit for longer than an hour at a time. And that's it. If you have any questions at all about how to set up your painting station or what you think is useful, or any questions about what brushes I use for what kinds of particular effects, then please feel free to go ahead and post comments and ask questions. Thanks very much for watching, and until next time, bye bye.